Welcome to Tom. We have all of our presenters here this morning and a tight timetable. It is 8:30 a.m. Pacific time to get underway. And my name is Ian Thompson. Welcome to the webinar, Advanced Biofuels Indispensable to a Net Zero Future. I'm the president of Advanced Biofuels Canada and have my colleague Faraz Haki online helping us. Just as we formally get underway, I want to respectfully acknowledge the land from which this webinar is being hosted is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. A couple of housekeeping points. Please turn your mute on if you're not the speaker. Turn camera off too, it would be helpful. If you have any questions as we go through, please put them into the chat box. We have a very full agenda today, so we're not going to stop to answer questions as they come up, but we do hope to have some time at the end of the webinar for that. Webinar presentations will be available afterward. We will send those to all attendees, and you'll also note that a number of the materials on the presentation are from our new website, netzerocleanfuels.ca. Those not familiar with Advanced Biofuels Canada, we're Canada's National Advanced Biofuels Trade Association, have been working since 2005 in all provincial and federal regulations on fuels and carbon policy. And we have approximately 25 members. Some of them will be profiled today. So I'm going to just go through here. And here we go. So we're going to kick off. Let me make sure that we've got here. Get a bit of a lag. So the presenters today are really, our agenda, which is, I'm just not seeing. Farah, are we seeing the slides? There we go. There we go. So the presenters for today, we will have a presentation on negative emission technologies from Jim Ram at Eco Engineers. We'll have Hamira Rafiq, Tom Dower, Anthony Reed, and Jean-Christophe Amato describing the technologies that their companies are using and deploying. And really, the core messages that we're going to be working on through the webinar are consistent with the content of our netzerocleanfuels.ca. We'll show that significant internal combustion engine emissions are unavoidable through 2050, and that's not because we can't force people out of them. It's just a range of factors, including legacies, etc. Cleaner fossil fuels are part of the picture, but they have limited greenhouse gas reduction potential. We'll discuss that. Really, we're left with two necessary pathways, which we'll talk about, but they're net zero and net negative carbon intensity liquid and gaseous fuels, such as renewable natural gas, are going to be indispensable to our net zero future. Conventional biofuels, that we traditionally think of as conventional, their carbon intensity trajectory is on its way to net zero, and there are a number of actions underway that Jim is going to speak to that will take those into net zero territory. Really, decarbonization from our perspective is going to come down to two necessary and complementary paths. One will be net zero or net negative clean fuels in internal combustion engines, liquid and gaseous. And then the other are going to be zero emission vehicles, such as those in an electric vehicle or a hydrogen platform, if they can use low or zero carbon intensity energies. And both of those platforms are going to be critical. In fact, that's really outside of urban design and active transportation, etc. Those are really going to be our two primary ways of getting to net zero. And then advanced biofuel and renewable synthetic fuel technologies are being deployed commercially and are deployed, and they are indeed scalable. From our perspective, with kind of a global perspective, the May 2021 IEA report on a net zero future spent a lot of time, and the press that it got was its modeling of a net zero emissions future. But the one that caught our eye was one called the All Policies case, or All Pledges case, and this looked at the the 81 countries that have some form of pledge, policy, or law regarding net zero, if all 81 of those countries fully executed, and by the way, they represent exactly 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. If all of them execute fully and on time, you are still left at 2050 with 83% of final transportation energy demand coming through an internal combustion engine. That's either liquid or energy. That's not to say that all of those will be fossil fuels, but that would be the IEA's projection. And there are a few people that I've spoken to that think that we will indeed meet all of those targets on time in full. Coming down to a more North American level, that one that many people on the call can understand, in the case of California, UC Davis looked with UC Santa Barbara, looked at the behest of the California EPA in a recent study, final transportation energy demand by 2050. And you can see on the chart here, we have fully 43% of final transportation energy demand will be supplied by low carbon intensity ethanol, renewable gasoline, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, and renewable natural gases in that mix. You can see on the slide, and it's certainly according to UC Davis, we are going to need significant growth in low carbon liquid fuels compatible with internal combustion engines. From a more Canadian perspective, our challenge here in front of us, that the gap between our national emissions and our commitments has always been there, but it is growing. And you can see this slide from Navius going from 1990 forward and all the various commitments, and then where we ended up at the date of those commitments, where our emissions ended up. And so really in our shop, we have across our staff about 15 plus years of federal and provincial fuels and carbon policy, and we have a rather pragmatic lens. We are of the view that carbon policy certainly here is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps back. We failed to bring the measures in to go for our commitments. That gap is growing. Delaying it out to 2030 or to 2035 by zero emission vehicle mandates is not going to address critical near-term emissions that have to happen if we're going to keep to 1.5 or even 2. We've all seen policy reversal risk. Think of the Ford government reversing its cap and trade arrangement with California and Quebec, and the what that does to our work to decarbonize transportation. And so really we need a pragmatic, adaptive approach to de-risk net zero targets. Just a comment on net zero. Some people think that net zero means we take all sectors and all subsectors to zero. We don't. Some are very difficult to decarbonize. And so what net zero means really is that you are going to have to curtail growth. You're going to have to do a lot of fuel switching, but at the end of the day, you're going to have some technologies that can actually remove carbon dioxide, and we're going to talk about some of those a little bit later. ICE with net fuels or carbon dioxide removal technologies really have the best potential for deep near-term reductions, and we can't get to net negative without those. Electric vehicles can be net neutral, hydrogen can be net neutral, but in the case of fuels like renewable natural gas, it would be, California is, 300% below the carbon intensity of diesel, for instance, with an RNG running a converted diesel engine. Some work from Navius earlier this year, and this came out in the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. We took the Navius data and we took off data scenarios that we believe are not very likely, like Canada goes it alone on climate. Doesn't return a very different result, frankly, than that presented in the CICC report. But what you can see here is that of these 62 scenarios narrowed down, light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, you're going to see some crossover somewhere in the mid 2040s to late 2040s in terms of the shares of vehicles on road. I think many people on this call will understand that in terms of final transportation energy demand, electric vehicles are far more efficient, probably 4 times the efficiency per megajoule of energy. So this isn't the amount of energy used, it's the number of vehicles on the road. And here's what we're left with at the end of that. So by 2050, internal combustion engine emissions are going to be 48 to 50%, depending on how the scenarios play out, of their 2020 levels under the full range of options. So the question is here, can we decarbonize transportation with fossil fuels? You're hearing a lot of net zero commitments out of oil and gas producers and refiners. Though the simple story is told right here in a life cycle chart. In the case of average oil sands derived crude and the average of gasoline and diesel in Canada, the energies added in the processing gasoline and diesel add 24% of the carbon intensity, but fully 76% of the full life cycle emissions occur when you turn on the ignition in your vehicle. So you could take every gram of carbon out of the processing of crude oil, it still leaves crude oil. And you're going to have 76% of those emissions going up until we figure out how to carbon capture and store the tailpipe on a vehicle. The only practical way to reduce the full life cycle on fuels is to fuel switch or displace crude, and those come from hydrogen electric vehicles running low carbon intensity energies, renewable natural gas, non-fossil synthetic fuels, and biofuels. That is just simple, it's inescapable physics. You need all of the above. Just a bit of reference here on, well, what can we do with the fuels that are in the market currently today? And the British Columbia Low Carbon Fuel Standard has been operating since 2010 on the renewable side, and 2013 on the carbon intensity signal side. And here's what we have. For biodiesel, these are volumes of biodiesel delivered into BC to meet the regulation. In the period 2010-2019, we've had 84% carbon intensity reduction. And a good part of that has come from feedstock switching. So what's depicted here is that by 2019, we actually had carbon neutral, was minus a couple of grams, the average carbon intensity of biodiesel delivered to BC. If we run our modeling of 3 different scenarios, including just the current trajectory, we're looking at minus 21 grams by 2030, and this would come from a combination of bioenergy capture and storage, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about work on soil organic carbon sequestration through enhanced farming practices in the case of more conventional biofuels, and then we're talking about avoidance of emissions, and this would be, for instance, with respect to methane. Ethanol. In the case of ethanol, 45% carbon intensity reduction, and we'll hear about some of the actions that are going on in the ethanol world from Jim Ram. And in renewable diesel or hydrogenation derived renewable diesel, 58%, and again, a good part of that comes from fuel from feedstock switching. So before we dig down into some of the pathways, what we are looking at by way of options from advanced biofuels and from renewable synthetic fuels are depicted here. Biomass is a feedstock, and that's been the traditional source of these fuel types, but increasingly we're seeing carbon dioxide as a fuel, and companies like Carbon Engineering doing work with CO2 and LanzaTech, etc. If you go to the Net Zero Clean Fuels website, you'll see most of these terms described. When it says bioethanol, that's ethanol, biodiesel, people understand. Transport fuels are a selection, but most of these would be fully fungible drop-in fuels that would come out of technology such as Fischer-Tropsch, etc. So we're going to move at this point to presenting presentation by Jim Ram, and we're great to have very grateful to have Jim join us today. He's with Eco Engineers as a member of Advanced Biofuels Canada. Jim's a professional engineer. He's a founding partner of Eco Engineers, and it's a renewable energy consulting and auditing company based in Des Moines, Iowa. Jim is the director of engineering there, and he runs their ethanol line of business. Has special expertise in the area of renewable fuel production, including kernel fiber ethanol and renewable natural gas. We're delighted to have Jim join us today.
Thanks very much, Ian. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to Advanced Biofuels Canada. And I appreciate the topic of net zero liquid fuels. I got passionate about biofuels, liquid biofuels. I spent my earlier career was in environmental cleanup, and I was doing environmental cleanup on a lot of the carcinogenic properties of fossil fuels. And one of the big things that renewable fuels gives us is a lot less environmental cleanup risk. And one of the sometimes uncited benefits beyond carbon. So when we're talking about solutions that are net zero, we're really talking about biomimicry. And I think people on this call, remember that we're always looking at what's going on in nature and nature-based solutions. So when we look at a wind turbine, we're really, they designed the blade of the wind turbine off of the fluke of a whale, right? And when we come up with something efficient, it's based in nature. So that could be the yeast that produces the ethanol. It could be the methanotrophic bacteria that produces the methane. It could be the biomass or the renewable biomass that takes the solar energy and stores it in corn or in beans or in wood or in agricultural residue. And so just from our standpoint, Eco Engineers is fuel and technology agnostic. We're national and international, market driven, and it's all the focus is on low carbon, and that's what we do. So if we're going to understand this, and I think that the policies in Canada and your discussions in Canada, I just want to put this slide up there that carbon dioxide, and these are numbers on the 100-year global warming potential from the International Panel on Climate Change. And carbon dioxide was given an equivalence value of 1 here. And we can see some of the nature-based solutions that can be had to try to impact our carbon emissions, right? So we could do carbon capture, enhanced oil recovery. We can use biomass as heat, landfill gas, solar, wind, efficiency, always. And we can dry the grains less. We can use fertilizer or biochar. We can do things with carbon dioxide to try to get to neutral. And then, but the things to keep in mind policy-wise is methane is 35 times worse a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So 34 times more of an impact. And so this anaerobic digestion is really important, and California has really led kind of a market development in dairy manure and swine manure and anaerobic digestion of things that might have gone to the landfill. And these are areas where we can really get negative carbon intensity scores, where they can drive our processes to net zero or negative numbers. And then nitrous oxide, this soil carbon question and the emissions from soil, that's 300 times worse a greenhouse gas. So this discussion around using fertilizer, using low carbon fertilizer, around sustainable agriculture, around use of biochar, no-till, cover crops is critically important. So this is from California Air Resources Board, and the color is the fuel type, the size of the dot is the volume, the center of the dot is the CI. This dot is the CI on a California basis of, here we have renewable diesel, there's some work to do to get it to zero, and biodiesel to get it to zero, and ethanol at about 59 to get it to zero. And this is kind of a California scorecard. I realize that we're talking Canada and the numbers could be a little bit different, but I think there are things to be learned here. So this is based on ethanol in California. And the thing that I would point out is the indirect land use change. It's about 20 CI points in California. And indirect land use change has been a big debate. And whether or not this 20 points is really kind of a market protection or whether it's based in science. So some of the early numbers were much higher than 20, and it's kind of like how fast will people adapt more scientific numbers. So it was nice to see Ian with some really strong carbon intensity reduction based on ILA. Oregon's at about half of this, at about 9.5, and the current science coming out of Argonne is below 5. So the other thing that we have is the corn farming, and there's a lot of work going on the corn farming and the soil health, and trying to bring this corn farming number down. Then the next line inside the plant is natural gas. So we could replace this with, instead of using fossil-based gas, we could replace this with biomass-based heat. We could replace this with solar heating. There are a lot of ways to bring this number down. And then the next is electricity use. So wind and solar would be great. Combined heat and power from biogas would also be great. Chemicals and enzymes, we're going to need a little bit. Co-product credits. So this is significant. So the credit from animal feeds in ethanol. And there should really be another green bar down here, which is carbon capture. And that has the ability to be like 30 points. So when we look at and this is, again, I'm sorry, based in California, and we've been participating, and ethanol producers have been aiming at California for so long. It's like, how do we get, this slide is looking at how do we get to carbon neutral based on a California scorecard. And so it is very possible to get there. The way that the feedstocks are, people can get to net zero emissions in California today. And what they need to do is combine a lot of these technologies, or combine some of these technologies, so that they can reach there. So it could be that using renewable natural gas, kernel fiber, carbon capture and sequestration, we can get there, and I can demonstrate that a little bit more. So ADM's on the call. They've been operating carbon capture for, a leader in carbon capture. Red Trail is on the way to implementation, and then we see these other announced parties that are at kind of letter of intent level here. There's a huge advantage with 45Q and with the possibility of adding in participation in low carbon fuel credits, that CCS is really positioned to expand. I think the other thing is this farm practices, big topic. So not only the farming energy and the fertilizers that we're using and the N2O emissions, but the carbon sequestration in the soil itself, big areas of discussion. So in this slide, I'm using from the environmental research letter from this year. So this is from Harvard and MIT, and they estimate that the carbon intensity of U.S. ethanol on average is about 51. So when we do carbon capture and sequestration, that's a minus 32. And so 51 minus 32, that leaves us with just 19 points to get to net zero. And so we can really get to net zero through a combination of renewable natural gas, just displacing part of the material, or biomass-based heat, or wind, or solar, or biochar, and really, again, kind of biomimicry, following a lot of nature-based solutions to get to net zero, and using renewable biomass, corn, beans, agricultural residue as storage, and then making liquid fuels that are kind of like a battery, are kind of like the energy storage idea. So really, we see the importance of these net zero liquid fuels, and the key takeaways is the focus is on sustainable agriculture, soil carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration, and biochar. And really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today, and I'll turn it back over.
Thanks very much, Jim. Appreciate that view. There is a lot happening, particularly in the United States, much of it driven by the state of California low carbon fuel standard there. And so understandable that we're seeing, in fact, it's great to have your firm depicting some of what you're seeing in the field with some of the clients that you deal with. In my earlier slide, I depicted all of the technologies and pathways that are represented in our membership. Jim was describing the traditional fermentation to bioethanol route, and ethanol just a ubiquitous fuel that many others have kind of built their businesses on the shoulders of. I want to move to some of the other technologies that are in play, and I want to make sure that I'm getting the right screen here. Give me a second. I'm going to dismiss all my reminders. They will come up surely again. So we have in our membership, we're going to depict 4 companies. We're going to take a look at Enerchem, we're going to take a look at Viterra Renewables, ADM, and LanzaTech. But we also have a number of other companies here that are very much in that space. So companies that are making biocrude or the precursor for renewable gasoline or diesel to be used in a refinery, Steeper Energy or Bios, Vorsan in some respects in that place. Companies that are making cellulosic fuels, whether they be biogas or ethanol in the case of Rebio and Iogen. Renewable Energy Group making renewable diesel and other products, carbon engineering in the direct air capture and synthesis space. And then Halter Topsoe and Honeywell UOP are large global engineering and technology providers that are at the center of some of the work right now going on in the refinery sector to incorporate renewable content into their fuel. So their technologies are depicted on our website and are very much at the center of the things. And what we want to do today is use go through a small number of the other platforms that are out there. And I'm going to introduce now Humera Rafiq, and Humera is, and I think in Montreal, if I'm not mistaken, she is the proposals manager in the business development group in Enerchem. She has a bachelor and master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, so we need to listen to her. She has 15 years of work in the petrochemical and refining sector, and Humera would probably be the first to tell you that much of the advanced technology and the plants that are coming up today look and feel and operate a lot like those in the petrochemical and refining sector. So Humera, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Ian, and thank you to Advanced Biofuels Canada for giving me the opportunity to present. just to let you know, yes, of course, I work for Enerchem that is headquartered out of Montreal, but I actually work out of California. So, I think maybe we can start with the next slide, please. Thank you. So I would like to start with an overview of Enerchem's technology. Enerchem's proprietary gasification technology uses a wide variety of waste and converts it into ultra-clean syngas to produce biofuels and chemicals. The advantage of Enerchem's technology, it has the flexibility to process a range of feedstock, which include municipal solid waste, non-recyclable plastics, and biomass residues. The waste is then sent through a thermochemical process that converts the carbon molecules into the waste fed in into ultra-clean syngas. The syngas can then be converted to chemicals, for example, biomethanol, a chemical building block, and bioethanol, which is used for biofood. The syngas can also be converted to sustainable aviation fuels, as well as naphtha feedstock for producing olefins. All of the above is done within a process that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, as well as provide a sustainable waste management solution. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Enerchem. Enerchem has been in the sustainable solution space for over 21 years. It has undergone a rigorous path to commercialization, scaling up from the lab and pilot phase in Sherbrooke to its facility in Edmonton. Its demonstration facility in Westbury, and then moving on to building a first-of-a-kind waste conversion facility in Edmonton, Alberta in 2013. It is now expanding by conducting worldwide projects in Canada, the US, Europe, and Asia. The company is backed by and partnered with major investors, as shown on the slide. Next slide, please. Some additional commercial projects include the Varennes project in Quebec. The Varennes carbon recycling project is currently under construction and will convert more than 200,000 tons of non-recycled waste and residual forest biomass to nearly 125 million liters of biofuel. Its first phase is scheduled for commissioning in 2023. Enerchem is also conducting a few projects in Europe, namely the Tarragona project in Spain for the production of methanol, and the Rotterdam project in the Netherlands, which is under development to produce sustainable aviation fuels. Enerchem is also actively developing opportunities in other regions around the world. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Humira. That's great, and great to see that we're on the same time zone. So we are going to move to a presentation by Tom Dower from LanzaTech, a company that many of you, as in the case of Enerchem, will be familiar with. And Tom has over 25 years of experience in Washington, D.C., in government and industry, including over 15 years on U.S. Senate staff on both sides of the political aisle. Before he came to LanzaTech, Tom spent 8 years as a senior director, government relations at ArcelorMittal, the world's largest leading steel and mining company. So great to have Tom with us to walk through LanzaTech and what the company has been doing and where it's going. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone. Good morning, or good afternoon for me in Washington. We can move on to the second slide. Thanks for having us. So I'm just going to go through a similar story to what you just heard about Enerchem. So LanzaTech is a rapidly expanding carbon recycling company. We're based near Chicago, Illinois, and we specialize in carbon utilization through gas fermentation. And as you can see here, we have over 1,000 patents that have been granted around the world. We have offices all around the world. We have an R&D center in Georgia in the United States, and we're over 200 staff, et cetera. And some of our funders are listed here. Next slide, please. So at a high level, we agree that much of our energy needs can be met with clean energy. But in the future, our lives will still depend upon products containing carbon. The question is where that carbon comes from, and we believe the most sustainable pathway is through recycled carbon. Next slide. And you can click all the way through to show When you get to green stuff, it should be done. So LanzaTech uses waste-based feedstocks, including industrial off-gases from steel mills or refineries, or gasified agricultural or forestry residues or solid waste. We take those gases and feed them into a bacteria-based fermentation process where our microbe converts them through a continuous process into ethanol, which we can sell as a fuel or further transform into sustainable jet fuel, chemicals, and products like plastics, rubber, fiber, and more. Next slide. So our gas fermentation process is proven at commercial scale, operating since 2018 at a steel mill in China. We brought a second plant online in April. Next slide. And then we are working with steel giant ArcelorMittal. You can advance the slide a little bit to give some numbers, but we're currently building Europe's first steel mill off-gas to ethanol facility in Belgium. Next slide. So we're currently deploying our technologies at demonstration, pilot, and commercial scales globally based on various feedstocks as described before. And we're working to deploy projects in North America, both in Canada and the US. Next slide. Looking to Canada specifically, we estimate, and there are some pictures. Sorry, I should have just sent a PDF. Still on the last one. But we're just talking about, if you can go back one, it's every waste resource, including carbon dioxide. So in Canada, we estimate there's significant potential to use gas fermentation to produce over 76 billion liters of ethanol per year from industrial off-gases and gasification of forest and agricultural wastes, as well as municipal solid waste. If you run all of that through our alcohol-to-jet technology for SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, we think we could produce over 45 billion liters of SAF and renewable diesel. And we have a very high SAF selectivity through the alcohol-to-jet pathway. And further yields could be achieved processing captured CO2 from direct air capture plus clean hydrogen. Next slide. And this is just to show that ethanol can be used, as was stated earlier, directly as a fuel or as a feedstock to produce ethylene, SAF, and many other products. And low carbon sustainable fuels, whether produced from renewable biological sources or from industrial emissions or CO2 directly, all have a role to play in Canada's climate policy. And then the next slide I will just leave as a leave behind on SAF specifically. It's a very hot topic. We just had a White House event last week on this with some new commitments for the United States, but this can really play another key role in fuel uptake for one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors, aviation. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to see LanzaTech's progress over the years, and I know in our former work we had quite a lot of interaction with Jennifer Holmgren, who's a passionate spokesperson in this space. I want to now move, thank you very much, Tom, to Anthony Reed with ADM. Some folks know it as Archer Daniels Midland. And I'm going to just go forward here. I'm going to, reference was made in Jim's work to ADM's CCS project in Decatur in Illinois, and Anthony's going to take us through that. Anthony's the Vice President of Federal Government Relations in ADM's Washington office. He oversees the government relations work for Canada and the US, primary responsibility for biofuels and environmental and sustainability policy issues in the DC office. And prior to ADM, Anthony was the Deputy Associate Administrator for Congressional Relations at the US EPA. So we're delighted to have Anthony here today. Over to you.
Thanks, Ian. And you can advance to the next slide. So just real quick on ADM in Canada, I thought it'd be useful to know. In Canada, ADM sources, stores, transports, and processes crops such as wheat and oil seeds at a total of 42 facilities with over 1,000 employees. These cover everything from wheat mills to oilseed crushing plants, grain elevators, and fertilizer mixtures. I will highlight in particular in Lloydminster, Alberta, we operate a canola crush plant and operate one of the largest biodiesel plants in Canada, where we produce about 70 million gallons of biodiesel per year. Next slide. So as as Jim kind of led in and Ian mentioned, I appreciate it. Jim stole a lot of my thunder here. We have been operating CCS projects at our North American headquarters in Decatur, Illinois, since 2009. We broke ground on our first project, the Illinois Basin Decatur project. It was a partnership with the Department of Energy where we injected 1 million tons of CO2 over a 3-year period into the Mount Simon sandstone geologic formation to demonstrate the ability to do permanent storage in a saline reservoir. And it was a very successful project. And we built upon that to do a second project in partnership with DOE, where we are doing 1 million tons per year over a 3-year period, including monitoring. And it's adjacent, relatively speaking. You see our footprint there to the right, adjacent to the first well. And the idea here is, again, to ramp up and show scale of permanent storage in the formation, but also to demonstrate the interaction and the movement of two plumes used at different wells. If we're going to continue to scale up CCS, it's important to be able to have multiple injection wells and be able to see how those interact about a mile underground. The formation that we're blessed with in kind of central U.S. Is capable of storing about up to 150 billion metric tons of CO2. So proving out the technology was kind of an important process for us to see how it works. And as Jim mentioned, we got into this in 2009. The lot of discussion. California was ramping up their LCFS and our AB 32. A lot of talk about cap and trade in the U.S. and other carbon mitigation schemes around the world. So we saw this as an important technology to get into. You see there, CCS can reduce the carbon intensity of ethanol by up to 55% or 33 grams of CO2 per megajoule. So there's significant opportunity here from a decarbonization standpoint. Next slide. And so as Jim also mentioned, I'm glad he mentioned this, we're going to need to utilize multiple technologies and build off even what we've started to do in Decatur and prove out additional stacking of technologies to get us to a net zero place. It's something that ADM is focused very heavily on how we can get. We just announced in the last couple of weeks we have a net zero flour milling operations in the U.S. and we see opportunities here in biofuels as well. One of our most recent announcements is a partnership with 8 Rivers Capital, where we're proposed to build a 300 megawatt zero emission power plant that would be built adjacent to our processing where we're currently injecting in Decatur. This will utilize the existing well. It literally has zero emissions. You could build this plant inside of a building. There's about a 3% loss on CO2, which is captured and then put into our existing well. So again, you stack on the CCS capabilities, you put on this net power potential of zero emissions, and you're getting really close to net zero already. So we're hoping to expand upon our site here and do that. And I think going forward, we hope to replicate these technologies at our facilities around the world, in the U.S. and in Canada. There's certainly great geology in Canada, as the government has proved out to do CCS, and then you can build off of that capability. Once you have the ability to store the CO2, there's a lot of different technologies and capabilities that can come along with that, some of which are in the development stage. So we're doing that at all of these things, and it's not here, but I should certainly mention, because Jim brought it up, we are extremely active in reducing emissions from our supply chain, and particularly on the on-farm emissions. It is the one place outside of our footprint that has low-hanging fruit. So we've done a lot of partnerships with farmers in the U.S. and in Canada to continue to work on voluntary practices that can reduce carbon, and governments are looking very closely at this. So we're certainly encouraged by things people are doing to get credit for things that are being done on farm. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's great to see, and I think a great depiction of the kind of technologies that the IEA has described as being critical to achieving net zero. And again, going back to the full life cycle, you can CCS fossil fuels, and you will certainly reduce their carbon intensity, but you can't get anywhere near the kinds of reductions that you get with a bioenergy CCS, which not only stores the carbon coming out of its process, but displaces gasoline or diesel or jet and gets the credit of that. So LanzaTech, ADM, all of these technologies are doing that. So great to see what ADM is doing. Up next, we have JC Amato with Viterra, and JC's got some news for us. JC is the CFO at Viterra. He's responsible for defining and implementing Viterra's financial strategy, leads all aspects of financing and accounting. JC is also the VP of Finance for Ensign. He's a graduate of the University of Oxford, an MSc in Environmental Change and Management, University of Ottawa, and the University de Rennes in European law. Welcome, JC.
Thanks, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the invitation to participate in the discussion. First, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. For many of you, Viterra Renewables will be a new name, but our team has been leading the way on advanced biofuels for 3 decades now under the name of Ensign Technologies. Earlier this year, Ensign created Viterra Renewables to have dedicated resources to deploy our decarbonization solutions in Canada and Europe, because we know that demand in those markets is projected to grow very rapidly. Do you have the slides up? Sorry, can everyone see the slides? Because I can't.
I believe we can.
I don't see them.
No.
Can you say that?
No.
I don't
Okay.
see the slides.
No, we're not
Great.
seeing.
Great. We're gonna give me a minute. We're gonna come back.
There it is.
Are we back?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, JC. Apologies. Keep going.
That's all right. Next slide. So our company has a unique technology and know-how to convert low-grade biomass residuals into liquid and solid decarbonization products. Our fast pyrolysis process is known as RTP. Essentially, we can convert any type of biomass residues from sawdust to wood chips, demolition wood, agricultural waste like corn husks and wheat straw into liquids and solids. We have a strict commitment to sustainability and strict chain of custody processes, and so we ensure that we only use wood or biomass residues from sustainably harvested operations. Right now, there's approximately 65 million liters of installed RTP capacity in North America, with the biggest plants located in Canada, in Renfrew, Ontario, and we have one in Port-Cartier, Quebec. Looking across our decarbonization solutions on the right-hand side of this slide, you can divide them into 3 classes. We have a low-carbon fuel oil product, which is used by heating customers like heavy industrial sites, hospitals, universities, district energy systems, and conversion to this low-carbon fuel requires minimal capital retrofits. Then we have the ability to extract biochemical feedstocks from our pyrolytic liquids for different uses in food and biochemicals. Our plants also produce a highly stable form of biochar, and we are working with partners on pathways to use biochar in construction materials to reduce petroleum-based products and also sequester carbon permanently in those products. And finally, we produce biocrude, which is a liquid low-carbon biointermediate that can be blended or co-processed with crude oil to produce low-carbon transportation fuels. Next slide. So our mission is to deliver deep cuts in greenhouse gases by providing customers with immediate and cost-efficient decarbonization solutions. On a life cycle basis, our low-carbon fuel is at least 90% less carbon intensive than its petroleum equivalents. as is. When you combine this with our carbon sequestration potential through biochar, we can achieve a net negative life cycle carbon intensity. We plan on expanding our commercial footprint in Canada and Europe with partners up to a total installed RTP capacity of around 3.8 billion liters per year by 2030. In the immediate term, we are working with Circa Group, which is a publicly listed company in Norway. Circa is building their first commercial plant in France to produce a specialty biochemical product known as sarin, which is a biosolvent. And that project represents a 22 million liter installed capacity for our technology, with the plant projected to come online in Q1 2023. In Canada, we're looking to build 2 new facilities in the next 2 years. One is in Atlantic Canada, and it will represent the first advanced biofuel plant in the region. We're working on permitting and engineering with partners for a 40 million liter plant in the region. And there's abundant sawmill residue sources there, and we're in discussion with several large heating fuel customers to decarbonize their operations. And the second project we're working on is an RTP facility that would be sited in an urban landfill site with large volumes of demolition wood. So in short, our company is capable to deliver massive amounts of carbon reductions and long-term carbon removal via biochar. And our success depends on governments implementing a level playing field for clean fuels like ours and promoting clean fuels as a way to deliver immediate decarbonization. Thank you.
And LanzaTech and Viterra and Ensign and a number of these companies, some people would describe as overnight successes, and those of us who've been watching for many years understand that it's been, in the case of Ensign, decades of work, some of it in the fossil sector to bring new environmental technologies there, then now coming over into the renewable space. So really appreciate that. So we're done with the presentations. We have a few more slides to go. We really wanted here to pick several things, and going back to the key messages. I think we're very clear that internal combustion engines are going to be with us for some time. Climate modelers tell us that reducing carbon out of the atmosphere today is critical and not waiting for a decade or two. And we also know that conventional biofuels, if you will, are seeing a dramatic change in their composition and their efficiency, as Jim described. And so we're working with those today, and those can bring significant improvements all the way to net zero. But we're also looking at remarkably promising technologies that, as Humera and as JC and Tom have described, are being deployed at scale now, driven by policy, driven by carbon pricing, driven by net zero commitments. So it's going to be an incredibly promising future. Just a quick snapshot here of our membership. You can see where they're located across the country. Some of these don't, for instance, have proposed plants like the one that JC described in Atlantic Canada, but this is a very dynamic map that's being updated constantly. The technologies and products that our members make are listed here, and they're not just physical products, but in the case of Jim's firm and others, some of the services that are critical to the markets functioning well, credit markets being reliable, robust, etc. So 15 years ago, when we started our work here, this was a very, very small list of companies and technologies and products and co-products. Lastly, just a snapshot of the resources that we've tapped into today. Net Zero Clean Fuels is a website that we will keep updated to describe the work going on in our area. We launched just last month the Canadian Transportation Fuels Dashboard. I encourage you to go there. That is a comprehensive listing of a lot of the data that's found in the Navius Research Biofuels in Canada report. It's not just about biofuels, there's a lot of conventional fuel reporting. And then also last month just launched an interactive Advanced Biofuel Canada member facility map, which describes a lot of the biorefining going on in the country, and it will tell you where, when, what kind of feedstocks, what kind of products, etc. So we have, just very grateful again to our presenters. We have about 5 minutes before the top of the hour, and at this point, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I would just open up the line to those with questions for our presenters. If you want to just unmute yourself and put yourself on camera, introduce yourself, please feel free to pose questions. So hearing none, I just want to go back and I think, Tom, you had said that 76 billion liters of ethanol potential, 45 billion liters of renewable diesel and SAF. Just maybe if you could describe kind of the timing to bring that kind of capacity online. That is based, I assume, on the resource that would be needed in the feedstocks to make those kinds of volumes. What would it take to get, in terms of scale up in plants, to those levels of production?
That's a great question. So those are total volumes that we think could be available. We've been scaling up the technology, to commercial scale in some instances already, like I talked about in terms of the industrial off gases, which provide an immediate fuel for us for our gas fermentation process. It would take, it's definitely going to take time to deploy these technologies again at scale, and the policy levers are so important, and that's the work we're doing not just in Canada but in the US, in India, in a number of countries in the EU, et cetera, to really bring those supply chains to market and to bear. So I think it's measured in decades to bring all of that online, but that's the nature of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? So but really, most importantly, and you made this point a moment ago, Ian, is early scale up. We have to deploy these technologies now, bring them all down the cost curve, and be able to, when we really truly need them, even more than today, right? When the climate crisis is even worse than it already is, and it's already terrible, there's going to be that moment where we don't have any more time left. And a lot of us think we're actually there now, but we need to deploy those technologies at scales that make today pale in comparison.
Sorry, I want to pose this question to JC and to Humera also. And Tom, you mentioned cost curves, and I know a long-standing concern in the whole sector has been, yes, we have these technologies, but they're expensive, et cetera. Without divulging confidential experience, what's your experience with LanzaTech, and then JC at Ensign and Viterra, and Humera at Enerchem? What's been the experience with the cost curve, and how the costs are coming down such that we can see, if not parity with traditional fuels, at least under the low carbon and fuel standards, and possibly carbon taxes, something where you can really be competitive? What's happening with the cost profile of these platforms? And maybe JC, you could kick it off, and then Humera, and then back to you, Tom.
Sure. I mean, at our own level, as we've scaled up our production capacity, we've seen like tremendous decrease in our production costs. So our ability to bring our costs down is incredible. And there are vast amounts of biomass residues that can be readily converted in Canada and in Europe. I think the biggest hurdle has been finding those markets where clean fuels like ours that have a decarbonization benefit are adequately, rewarded for those decarbonization benefits, right? And so I think that a lot of us are able to deploy those technologies at scale and really ramp up our production capacity and bring that cost down the curve. But we need the commercial offtake to be ready, right? To pay a fair price for those products. And that goes back to the role of government to create a level playing field. It goes back to having pricing on carbon that really reflects the social cost of carbon, and having all those things in place.
Couldn't agree more. Humera, what's been the Enerchem perspective on the improvement in efficiencies as you continue to roll out these facilities?
So from our perspective, we've been very optimistic, but I think as JC was mentioning as well, and Tom too, that it will still take several commercial scale facilities to be built before we can compare with the traditional fuels. This is particularly, this is because of some of the uncertainty around some of the regulatory programs. So, of course, so we'd continue to build, continue to scale up, but there is support that would be required for this.
Tom, what's been the LanzaTech experience?
Well, I'd say in the initial years of our 16-year existence, there was a lot of work on the gas fermentation process itself. And that is now quite well understood, and we can accept so many different types of feedstock, including carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. So now we're looking at those feedstocks and working with gasification technologies, for example, and direct air capture and getting hydrogen. So it's about combining other technologies as well to go together. And then on the back end, working through the conversion of ethanol, acetone, PET, and other chemicals to specific kinds of products. And you're getting into those with those customers and those supply chains that today, again, absent a price on carbon, are highly favoring fossil-based, cheap, not incorporating the social cost of carbon into them. So again, that's where policy becomes so important.
Thank you. I think we all agree on that point. I'm going to put my last question to Jim. Jim, you walked us very capably through the kinds of technologies, and I really appreciate the global warming potential of the different gases and why you focus on them. You looked at liquid fuels, and you looked more on the ethanol side. Gaseous fuels are also really critical in California standards and will be in Canada, and also on the distillate side, the renewable diesels and biodiesels. Are you seeing kind of comparable efficiencies in technologies and et cetera being applied to those fuels also to bring their CIs down?
Yes, absolutely, Ian. So Argonne put out a model to cover corn farming, but also bean farming is coming as far as farm practices go, and many of the technologies that are listed there are relevant to different types of renewable fuel production. So yeah, renewable fuels having a place to monetize, then that really drives push to net zero.
That's great, thank you. We're going to wrap. We are at a couple of minutes past the past 11 at 12:30 Eastern. Just want to say again, thank you to the many people who showed up to encourage us to put on this webinar. A huge round of appreciation to our panelists and speakers. Great to be able to tap your knowledge and experience. We hope to have further webinars to profile the kind of work that is happening in the advanced biofuel and renewable synthetic space, and keep you abreast of it. We will be sharing the presentation afterward. Please do follow up with me if you wish to ask specific questions of any of our presenters. I'll be pleased to connect you. And on that note, just thank you very much for attending, and hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care all.